Back in 1996, long before global giants set up shop in India, a local brand managed to convince a nation of devoted tea drinkers to hand over 25 rupees for a cup of espresso. Café Coffee Day, or CCD, pioneered the third place in India, that crucial hangout spot between home and the office. At its peak, CCD was everywhere. They scaled up to over 1,700 outlets blanketing the country. Going on a date, prepping for an interview, or just killing time, you sat on their red couches. The architect behind this empire was V.G. Siddhartha. He built the brand from scratch, leveraging his background in coffee plantations to create a retail giant. Because CCD had such an absolute grip on the Indian market, its financial stability was essentially taken for granted. To the public, the idea of this coffee monopoly suddenly collapsing felt impossible. But in July 2019, Siddhartha told his driver he was going for a walk near a bridge in Mangaluru. He vanished into the night, and his body was found 2 days later. Shortly after, a letter surfaced. It was addressed to his board of directors and employees, and it painted a picture of a company quietly buckling under immense, invisible weight. In the letter, Siddhartha cited 3 specific pressures that drove him to the edge: a severe liquidity crunch, harassment from tax officials attaching his shares to block deals, and aggressive private equity partners forcing him to buy back equity. At the very bottom of the page, he made one final, defiant claim. He wrote, "Our assets outweigh our liabilities and can help repay everybody." At the time of his death, Coffee Day Enterprises was carrying a staggering 7,214 crore in debt, nearly $1 billion. We need to look at the math to see if Siddhartha's final assessment was a delusion or a verifiable financial fact. To understand how a coffee shop racks up $1 billion in debt, you have to look at the fundamental economics of retail cafes. Selling cups of coffee requires expensive real estate and heavy operational costs, leaving incredibly thin profit margins. To offset those thin margins, Siddhartha employed an aggressive strategy. He borrowed heavily against his shares, taking on debt not to open more cafes, but to diversify far outside of the coffee business. He used borrowed money to buy a 90-acre tech park, logistics companies, and a 20% stake in Mindtree. The structural flaw was a mismatch, paying for highly illiquid real estate and tech investments using high-interest, short-term debt. This structural mismatch created a fatal vulnerability. The empire looked massive on paper, but if cash flow was disrupted for even a few weeks, the entire structure would collapse on itself. In 2019, that disruption arrived from 2 directions at once. Lenders suddenly began sawing in their short-term debts, and tax officials attached Siddhartha's shares to block pending deals. These actions instantly froze the company's cash flow. With shares locked up, Siddhartha couldn't sell assets to service debt or meet private equity demands. The liquidity crunch proved that the overarching leverage strategy had failed, regardless of the performance of the coffee business itself. Following the tragedy, Siddhartha's wife, Malavika Hegde, took over as CEO. Instead of filing for bankruptcy, she committed to a strategy that would fulfill the exact promise her husband made in his final letter. She executed a ruthless asset monetization strategy. The goal was to immediately liquidate those non-core holdings and turn them into cash. They sold their Mindtree stake to L&T and the Global Village Tech Park to Blackstone, injecting over 1,600 crore into debt repayment. Operationally, Hedge shrank the cafe from 1,192 to 495, pivoting heavily to their 38,000 automated corporate vending machines for stable cash flow. She systematically dismantled the sprawling, diversified empire her husband had built, solely to save the underlying coffee company he originally founded. By the time the company released its March 2022 financial filings, the results of this liquidation were clear. The crushing debt load of 7,214 crore had been brought down to 1,810 crore. In just 3 years, the new management had managed to erase nearly 75% of the company's total debt burden. There are still hurdles ahead, like recovering massive dues from various subsidiaries and joint ventures. The company is stabilized, but the financial recovery is an ongoing process. But when you trace the math from 2019 to today, Siddhartha's final financial assessment proves to be completely accurate. The assets did outweigh the liabilities, and they were used to repay the lenders. Corporate leverage is a double-edged sword that builds empires but destroys them when liquidity dries up. In a bitter piece of irony, the exact aggressive non-coffee diversifications that caused the fatal liquidity crunch ultimately provided the assets needed to save the company.